On May 16, 1945, at 2:14 in the afternoon, a British landing craft moved slowly toward the stone quay of Alderney Harbor in the Channel Islands. Although Germany had officially surrendered just days earlier and celebrations were erupting across Europe, there was no sense of triumph here. The sky hung low and gray over the water, and the only sound was a dull scrape of metal against stone as the boat touched the dock. Sergeant Thomas Whitmore stepped ashore first, followed by 40 men of the Hampshire Regiment, all of them alert and prepared for resistance. Whitmore had fought through Normandy and survived the bitter winter fighting in the Ardennes, and he believed he understood what liberation looked like. Yet the silence that greeted him felt unnatural. There were no civilians rushing forward in relief, no white flags waving from windows, no scattered gunfire from desperate holdouts. Instead, the harbor stood frozen, as though time itself had stalled 5 years earlier when German forces first occupied this small piece of British territory. Alderney had been evacuated in 1940, its population removed before the German occupation began, and during the years that followed, the island had been transformed into a heavily fortified outpost of the Third Reich. As Whitmore and his men advanced cautiously into the town, they found buildings intact but lifeless. A rusted bicycle leaned against a garden wall. Shop signs creaked in the wind, and curtains stirred behind broken glass. The absence of destruction was almost more unsettling than ruins would have been. This was not a battlefield shattered by artillery. It was a place methodically emptied and repurposed. Moving inland, the soldiers began to encounter the scale of that transformation. Massive concrete bunkers had been carved into the cliffs. Anti-aircraft guns remained aimed uselessly at the sky, and heavy artillery positions faced the sea as part of Hitler's Atlantic Wall. The Germans had invested enormous resources into turning this tiny island into a fortress designed to repel an invasion that never came. Ammunition crates lay abandoned inside cold concrete chambers. It was clear that the garrison had withdrawn quickly as the war collapsed. Yet the most disturbing discovery was not among the coastal defenses. As the patrol pushed farther inland, the character of the landscape shifted. Defensive barbed wire gave way to fencing arranged not to keep invaders out, but to keep prisoners in. Watchtowers rose above rows of wooden barracks, laid out with precise German order. The gate stood open, and painted in stark letters on a concrete wall was a single word: Eswaldi. At first glance it resembled other camps British forces had encountered during the final months of the war, but there was something uniquely jarring about this one. It stood not in Germany or Poland, but on British soil. As Whitmore stepped through the entrance, he immediately sensed the difference between military infrastructure and a place built for confinement. Inside the barracks were wooden bunks stacked 3 high, each barely wide enough for a grown man to lie down. Straw mattresses lay darkened with stains, and tin bowls sat abandoned on rough tables, some still containing hardened scraps of food. It appeared the camp had been evacuated in haste. Papers were scattered across floors, some partially burned, and doors swung loosely in the wind. On the walls of one barracks, Whitmore noticed scratches carved into the wood. Names, dates, and short prayers had been etched by hands that likely lacked proper tools. The languages were varied: Russian, Polish, French, evidence that the prisoners brought here had come from across occupied Europe. One wall bore a series of tally marks, hundreds of them, carved carefully and deliberately, suggesting a grim effort to count days or survive them. The presence of SS insignia confirmed what many of the soldiers already suspected. This was not merely a labor camp attached to the island's fortifications. It was a concentration camp operated under SS authority. The realization settled heavily over patrol. They had come expecting to secure a surrendered garrison, yet instead they were walking through the remnants of systematic imprisonment and abuse. For Whitmore and his men, the significance was unmistakable. This was British Crown territory, occupied for 5 years and used by the SS to enforce the ideology and brutality of the Reich. The silence inside the camp felt different from the silence of the harbor. It was not simply the quiet of abandonment, but the residue of something darker, as if the structures themselves retained memory. A young private standing near one of the watchtowers reportedly muttered in disbelief that all of this had happened on British land. Whitmore offered no immediate reply, because the truth required none. The war in Europe had ended, but what had taken place here would demand investigation, documentation, and judgment. The discovery of SYLT was more than a tactical event. It was a confrontation with the fact that the machinery of the SS concentration camp system had operated beyond continental Europe and onto British soil. In that moment, as the wind moved across empty barracks and watchtowers cast long shadows in the afternoon light, Whitmore understood that victory would not be measured solely by the defeat of enemy armies. It would also be defined by how Britain chose to respond to what it had found. In the days following the discovery of SYLT, the initial shock experienced by Sergeant Whitmore and his men began to give way to a more methodical process. Infantry soldiers were not investigators, and while they secured the island and ensured no hostile forces remained, word of what had been found quickly reached London. Within weeks, Major Theodore Panchev was dispatched to Alderney with explicit instructions from the War Office. Document everything. His task was not merely to confirm the existence of the camp, but to establish its function, its chain of command, and the extent of crimes committed there. What Panchev encountered was a sight that bore all the structural hallmarks of a concentration camp administered by the SS. Although initially established as a labor camp to house foreign workers forced to construct fortifications for the Atlantic Wall, SYLT had evolved into something far more severe after the SS assumed control in 1943. Under their authority, the camp operated not only as a source of forced labor, but as an instrument of punishment, terror, and ideological enforcement. Panchev's investigation unfolded over several months and relied on an extraordinary range of sources. Survivors who had been transferred from Alderney before liberation were tracked down across Europe and interviewed in detail. Civilians from neighboring islands were questioned, as were captured German personnel who had served in administrative or guard roles. From these interviews, a consistent pattern emerged. Prisoners brought to SYLT included Soviet prisoners of war, Eastern European laborers, political detainees, and resistance suspects from across occupied territories. They were transported under guard, assigned identification numbers, and immediately subjected to exhausting labor-constructing bunkers, gun emplacements, tunnels, and defensive barriers that formed part of Hitler's Atlantic Wall. Work days were long, rations were deliberately insufficient, and medical care was virtually non-existent. Those who collapsed from exhaustion were beaten, and in many documented cases, shot or left untreated until they died. The purpose was not merely productivity. It was domination reinforced through fear. The physical layout of the camp confirmed survivor testimony. The SS quarters were structurally superior to the prisoner barracks, built with better materials and more space, reflecting a rigid hierarchy embedded even in architecture. Prisoner huts were overcrowded, with bunks stacked 3 high and barely enough room for movement. Isolation cells existed for punishment, and certain cleared areas near the perimeter fence were later identified by investigators as likely execution sites. Perhaps most significant was the discovery of a partially burned logbook in a guardroom. Though damaged by water and fire, it remained legible enough to provide damning evidence. The entries were written in precise German script and recorded arrivals, work assignments, disciplinary measures, and deaths. Causes of death were noted with bureaucratic detachment. Shot while attempting escape, died of exhaustion, executed by order. The tone of the document was clinical, devoid of emotion, revealing a system that treated suffering as an administrative detail. This was not random cruelty committed by rogue individuals. It was regulated brutality embedded within official procedure. Panchev meticulously cross-referenced these records with testimony gathered from survivors. Many accounts describe daily roll calls that lasted for hours regardless of weather conditions. Prisoners were forced to stand in wind and rain while SS officers inspected them, sometimes selecting individuals at random for punishment. Witnesses recounted beatings administered publicly to reinforce discipline, and hangings carried out before assembled inmates as warnings. Food allocations were consistently below subsistence levels, weakening prisoners physically and psychologically. Several survivors described the constant uncertainty of selection, never knowing whether a summons meant transfer to another work detail or imminent execution. Mortality rates remain debated among historians, but it is widely accepted that a significant number of those brought to SYLT did not survive their internment. Some were buried in unmarked graves on the island, while others were cremated or transferred before death to obscure evidence as the war turned against Germany. The broader historical context added another layer of gravity to the findings. The Channel Islands, including Alderney, are crown dependencies of Britain, and their occupation in 1940 marked the only part of British territory seized and held by Nazi Germany. The establishment of an SS concentration camp therefore, carried symbolic weight beyond its physical footprint. While Allied forces were liberating camps across Germany and Poland in 1945, uncovering the full horror of the Holocaust, SYLT represented a chilling extension of that system onto British soil itself. The SS personnel who administered it were not conventional soldiers operating under standard military codes. They were members of an ideological organization directly accountable to Heinrich Himmler and dedicated to enforcing racial and political doctrine. Within that structure, brutality was not incidental. It was policy. As evidence accumulated, Pancheff's investigation evolved from documentation to identification. Names of commandants, officers, guards, and administrative staff were extracted from camp records and corroborated by survivor statements. Ranks were verified, transfers traced, and last known postings recorded. It became clear that many of those responsible had evacuated the island shortly before British forces arrived, likely anticipating accountability. Others attempted to blend into the wider mass of German surrender, claiming affiliation with the regular Wehrmacht rather than the SS. Yet the documentation they left behind undermined such efforts. The very efficiency with which the SS had managed camp operations now exposed them. Each recorded death, each signed order, each roster entry created a paper trail that could not be easily erased. By late summer 1945, Pancheff had assembled a comprehensive report detailing the camp's structure, administration, and documented abuses. His findings established SYLT not merely as a labor site, but as a concentration camp operating within the broader SS system. The implications were profound. This was not an improvised facility created under battlefield pressure. It was a deliberate extension of the Reich's machinery of repression. The British government now faced a question that extended beyond historical record. With evidence in hand and suspects identified, how would those responsible be treated? The soldiers who first walked through the abandoned barracks had felt anger and disbelief. Investigators who studied the logbook felt something colder: clarity. Crimes had been committed, and they had been committed in an organized, documented manner. The war in Europe had ended, but for SYLT, the process of reckoning was only beginning. By the time Major Pancheff's investigation had established the full nature of SYLT as an SS-run concentration camp, the immediate emotional shock felt by the first British troops had hardened into a deeper and more complicated reality. Evidence had been collected, survivor testimony preserved, and names of those responsible identified. The question now facing British authorities was not whether crimes had occurred, but how the perpetrators would be handled. In the chaotic aftermath of Germany's surrender, Europe was filled with displaced persons, surrendered troops, and former officials attempting to vanish into anonymity. Many SS personnel from Alderney had evacuated before liberation, retreating either to mainland Europe or attempting to merge into the mass of Wehrmacht prisoners. Others destroyed identification papers and denied SS affiliation altogether. Yet the British investigation, built upon cross-reference camp records and consistent testimony, gradually narrowed the field of suspects. The administrative precision that had characterized SYLT's operations now became the mechanism through which its former staff could be traced. British forces who located former SYLT personnel faced an intensely human dilemma. The soldiers assigned to guard captured Germans had often seen the camp firsthand. They had walked through barracks where men had starved, seen tally marks scratched into wooden walls, and read entries in a logbook that recorded executions with chilling efficiency. Anger among the ranks was not hypothetical. It was immediate and deeply personal. Across Europe, Allied troops were encountering the broader system of Nazi camps, including places such as Bergen-Belsen and Dachau, where scenes of mass suffering left even seasoned veterans shaken. Against that backdrop, the discovery that an SS camp had operated on British territory intensified the sense of violation. For many soldiers, summary punishment would have felt emotionally justified. They had weapons, authority, and the moral outrage of victors confronting atrocity. Yet, British military policy left little ambiguity. Captured enemy personnel, including members of the SS, were to be processed according to the Geneva Convention. Arrests were carried out formally, identities verified, and detainees classified as prisoners of war pending further investigation. This was not framed as mercy, but as adherence to established doctrine. Britain had maintained throughout the war that its conduct would be guided by international law, even when confronting an enemy that systematically disregarded it. The policy rested on several practical considerations. Humane treatment of prisoners encouraged compliance and reduced the likelihood of violent resistance within POW camps. It also reinforced Britain's diplomatic position in ensuring reciprocal treatment for its own captured servicemen. Most importantly, it preserved the legal foundation necessary for prosecuting war crimes through recognized tribunals rather than ad hoc vengeance. Interrogations of suspected SYLT personnel were conducted methodically. Investigators confronted detainees with documentary evidence, cross-checked alibis against transport records, and compared statements with survivor testimony. Some suspect attempted to minimize their roles, claiming they had merely followed orders or served in administrative capacities without direct involvement in abuse. Others denied knowledge of executions or mistreatment, attributing deaths to illness or wartime shortages. However, the partially burned logbook recovered at SYLT proved difficult to refute. It bore signatures and annotations linking specific officers to disciplinary measures and recorded deaths. Survivor accounts often corroborated these entries, identifying particular guards who had administered beatings or supervised punishments. The cumulative weight of documentation steadily undermined claims of ignorance or innocence. One recurring element in interrogation transcripts was surprise. Several former SS officers reportedly expected harsher, immediate consequences. On the Eastern Front, advancing Soviet forces had shown little patience for SS units, and many assumed similar treatment would follow capture by any Allied army. Instead, they were fingerprinted, photographed, assigned POW numbers, and transferred to detention facilities where they received regular meals and medical attention. This contrast did not go unnoticed by British personnel. Guards who had witnessed SYLT's conditions sometimes expressed frustration at providing adequate rations to men who had deliberately starved others. Nevertheless, discipline was maintained. Officers reminded their subordinates that the distinction between Allied forces and the regime they had defeated lay precisely in such restraint. Justice would be delivered, but it would be delivered through courts, not through impulsive reprisal. The broader context of post-war Europe reinforced this approach. As the International Military Tribunal convened in Nuremberg to prosecute leading Nazi officials, the principle of structured legal accountability gained prominence. War crimes trials were intended not merely to punish individuals, but to establish a historical and judicial record that could withstand scrutiny. Britain's handling of SYLT personnel aligned with this objective. By preserving evidence, ensuring procedural fairness, and adhering to recognized legal standards, British authorities aimed to demonstrate that the rule of law persisted even in victory. This approach required patience. Building cases took months, and assembling witnesses scattered across a devastated continent demanded coordination and persistence. For the soldiers and investigators directly involved, the process demanded emotional discipline. The temptation to equate justice with immediate retaliation was strong, particularly in light of the atrocities being uncovered elsewhere. Yet British command emphasized that vengeance, however understandable, risked undermining the moral authority upon which post-war reconstruction depended. If trials were to carry legitimacy, they had to be conducted without the taint of extrajudicial violence. This insistence on procedure did not erase anger. Rather, it channeled it into documentation, testimony, and legal preparation. Every interrogated suspect, every verified name, and every authenticated record became part of a deliberate movement toward accountability. By late 1945, many of the principal figures associated with SYLT had been located and detained. The investigative phase had transitioned into preparation for a formal prosecution. What had begun as a silent discovery on an abandoned island was now evolving into a test of Britain's commitment to its own principles. The crimes of SYLT were no longer rumors etched into wooden barracks. They were documented charges awaiting judicial review. In choosing to proceed through law rather than reprisal, Britain was defining the character of its victory. The battlefield struggle had ended in May 1945, but the moral dimension of that victory would be determined in courtrooms. where evidence would speak and judgment would be rendered according to statute rather than fury. By early 1946, the investigative work surrounding SYLT had moved from detention and interrogation to formal prosecution. The immediate chaos of Germany's surrender had begun to settle into structured post-war administration, and across Europe, Allied powers were establishing mechanisms to hold perpetrators accountable. The most prominent proceedings were unfolding at Nuremberg, where leading figures of the Nazi regime faced charges before the International Military Tribunal. Yet alongside those high-profile cases, numerous national courts were preparing prosecutions for crimes committed on their own territories. For Britain, SYLT fell squarely into that jurisdiction. The camp had operated on British soil, and the evidence gathered by Major Panchev and his team provided a clear legal foundation for war crimes charges. Prosecutors approached the cases methodically. They relied heavily on documentary evidence recovered from the camp itself, including the partially burned logbook that had survived attempted destruction. That logbook, written in careful German script, became one of the most significant pieces of evidence. It detailed prisoner arrivals, labor assignments, disciplinary actions, and recorded deaths with administrative precision. Each entry demonstrated that violence at SYLT was not spontaneous, but regulated and recorded. Survivor testimony reinforced these records. Former prisoners described specific incidents of beatings, hangings, and executions carried out under the supervision or direct order of identifiable officers. Cross-referencing between documents and witness accounts allowed prosecutors to construct individual cases rather than vague accusations. Responsibility was traced through signatures, orders, and command hierarchies. The defendants were provided legal representation and informed of the charges against them. The British government was acutely aware that the legitimacy of the trials depended on procedural fairness. The crimes alleged were severe: willful murder, torture, deliberate starvation, and violations of the laws and customs of war. But the process itself was designed to reflect established judicial standards. Evidence was presented publicly, witnesses were examined and cross-examined, and defense counsel were permitted to challenge the prosecution's claims. This was not an improvised tribunal fueled by outrage. It was a structured legal proceeding intended to withstand scrutiny both domestically and internationally. Several defendants attempted to rely on the familiar defense of obedience to superior orders. They argued that disciplinary measures, including executions, had been authorized by higher command and were carried out within the framework of military directives. British prosecutors countered that orders violating international law could not absolve individuals of responsibility. The principle that unlawful orders do not justify unlawful actions had become central to post-war jurisprudence, particularly in the wake of revelations from camps across Europe. In court, the bureaucratic efficiency that once shielded the camp's operations now served as incriminating proof. Signed reports, recorded punishments, and mortality figures established a pattern of conduct that extended beyond isolated incidents. Sentences varied depending on rank, authority, and degree of involvement. Guards who could plausibly demonstrate limited roles or coercion sometimes received lengthy prison terms rather than capital punishment. Senior officers who had exercised command authority and directly ordered executions faced harsher penalties. In several cases, convictions resulted in death sentences carried out by hanging, administered under formal military procedure. Each execution was recorded, witnessed, and documented according to legal protocol. The symbolism was unmistakable. Those who had overseen a system of extrajudicial killing were themselves subjected to a judicial process before facing punishment. Beyond individual accountability, the trials served a broader purpose. They created an official record of what had occurred at SYLT, preserving testimony and evidence for future generations. The partially burned logbook, once intended to regulate prisoners, was entered into evidence and photographed for archival preservation. Its pages became historical artifacts, demonstrating how ordinary administrative routines have been adapted to sustain cruelty. The trials also reinforced Britain's wartime narrative that it fought not merely to defeat an enemy, but to uphold a system grounded in law. By adhering procedure, even when dealing with former SS personnel, Britain underscored a deliberate distinction between its own conduct and that of the regime it had defeated. The impact of these proceedings extended beyond the courtroom. Within the British Armed Forces, the handling of SYLT cases reinforced discipline and institutional identity. Soldiers who felt anger upon discovering the camp saw that justice, though slower than vengeance, carried a different weight. Rather than an immediate emotional release, the trials offered a structured resolution that affirmed legal principles. Internationally, the prosecutions aligned with broader Allied efforts to define crimes against humanity and codify standards that would shape post-war international law. The idea that individuals could be held personally responsible for atrocities committed under state authority marked a significant development in legal history. By the conclusion of the SYLT trials, a clear message had been established. The concentration camp system had extended even to British territory, but its administrators would not evade accountability through chaos or denial. They would face documented charges, structured trials, and sentences imposed according to statute. In this measured process, Britain articulated a philosophy of victory, grounded not in retaliation, but in rule of law. The legal reckoning at SYLT demonstrated that civilization's strength lay not only in military success, but in capacity to administer justice impartially, even against those who had shown none themselves. When the trials concluded and sentences were carried out, the immediate legal chapter of SYLT's story came to an end, but its historical and moral implications continued to unfold quietly in the decades that followed. Alderney returned to civilian administration, and former residents who had been evacuated in 1940 gradually came back to rebuild their lives. The physical structures of occupation were dismantled or left to decay, and for many years the island's wartime history existed in an uneasy silence. Unlike the large extermination camps uncovered in continental Europe, SYLT occupied a more complicated place in British memory. It had operated on British soil, under German control, and its existence challenged the simplified narrative of an island nation that had resisted occupation entirely. The Channel Islands, including Alderney, had been the only part of British territory seized and held by Nazi Germany, and that reality carried a certain discomfort in the post-war period. For decades, discussion of SYLT remained limited. Some of the camp structures deteriorated naturally, reclaimed by vegetation and weather. Visitors to Alderney often saw only the remnants of bunkers and fortifications, not fully aware that an SS concentration camp had once stood among them. The broader story of the Holocaust and Nazi camp systems dominated public consciousness, and the smaller but symbolically powerful history of SYLT faded into relative obscurity. Yet archival records preserved by British authorities ensured that the evidence did not disappear entirely. Reports compiled by Major Panchev, interrogation transcripts, trial proceedings, and the surviving logbook were stored in military archives, available to researchers who chose to look deeper. In the early 21st century, renewed scholarly interest began to re-examine the wartime history of the Channel Islands. Among the researchers who brought significant attention back to SYLT was Caroline Sturdy-Calls, whose forensic archaeological investigations applied modern scientific methods to the site. Through detailed mapping, ground-penetrating radar, and structural analysis, her team reconstructed the layout of the camp with remarkable precision. Their findings confirmed what wartime investigators had documented. SYLT had functioned as a concentration camp administered by the SS, complete with prisoner barracks, guard quarters, punishment areas, and likely burial sites. The physical evidence reinforced survivor testimony and archival documentation, ensuring that the camp's existence could not be dismissed as exaggeration or misunderstanding. These renewed investigations did more than clarify architectural details. They reopened broader questions about memory and responsibility. Why had SYLT remained so little discussed compared to other camps? Part of the answer lay in scale, but another part lay in national narrative. Britain's wartime identity was shaped by resilience, resistance, and eventual victory. The existence of a concentration camp on British soil complicated that narrative. Even though it had been imposed by occupation, revisiting SYLT required acknowledging not only the crimes committed there, but also the complexities of occupation, evacuation, and survival in the Channel Islands. It required confronting the reality that the machinery of the SS had extended further than many preferred to remember. Yet the rediscovery of SYLT also highlighted another dimension of Britain's wartime legacy, the manner in which justice had been pursued. The documentation preserved in archives demonstrated that, even amid anger and outrage, British authorities had chosen legal process over extrajudicial punishment. The contrast between the camp's internal logbook and the structured records of its subsequent trials revealed two competing systems. One system recorded suffering as administrative routine, reducing human lives to entries in a ledger. The other system recorded evidence in order to establish accountability through law. In that contrast lay a fundamental distinction about the nature of power. At SYLT, power had been used to dominate and dehumanize. In the trials that followed, power was restrained and directed through procedure. The broader significance of this distinction becomes clearer when placed within the context of post-war Europe. The Allied commitment to structured war crimes trials, including those conducted at Nuremberg, helped establish precedents that would shape international law for decades. The principle that individuals could be held responsible for crimes against humanity, regardless of rank or obedience to orders, emerged from this period. Britain's handling of SYLT aligned with that evolving framework. By insisting on due process, it reinforced the idea that justice must be visible, documented, and defensible. The objective was not merely punishment, but the affirmation of standards that distinguished lawful governance from totalitarian rule. For the soldiers who had first entered the abandoned camp in May 1945, these long-term developments were likely distant considerations. What they encountered was immediate and visceral. Empty barracks, scratched names on wooden walls, and evidence of calculated cruelty. Their initial anger was human and understandable, yet their restraint, guided by policy and command discipline, became part of the island's legacy as surely as the camp itself. The decision not to execute captured SS personnel on the spot, but to arrest and prosecute them, was not an act of leniency. It was an assertion that the values for which Britain claimed to fight would persist even when confronted with provocation. Today, the remains of SYLT stand as both warning and lesson. They remind visitors that even small and seemingly remote places can become sites of profound injustice when ideology and unchecked authority converge. They also demonstrate that the conclusion of war does not automatically resolve moral questions. Victory on the battlefield must be followed by choices about accountability, memory, and principle. In the case of SYLT, Britain's choice to pursue justice through law rather than vengeance shaped the meaning of its triumph. The island that once symbolized occupation and oppression ultimately became an example of how power can be exercised with restraint. The story that began at 2:14 in the afternoon on May 16, 1945, therefore extends beyond a single discovery. It encompasses the transformation of evidence into testimony, testimony into charges, and charges into verdicts. It encompasses decades of silence followed by renewed examination. Above all, it underscores a central idea, that the true measure of victory lies not only in defeating an enemy, but in maintaining the standards that define one's own civilization. At SYLT, Britain confronted the physical remnants of cruelty on its own soil. In choosing law over retaliation, it sought to demonstrate that strength is not proven by the capacity to inflict harm, but by the discipline to administer justice within the bounds of principle. In the quiet, windswept fields of Alderney, nothing seems to remain of SYLT but broken concrete and fading earth. Yet history does not disappear simply because structures collapse. It lives in records, in testimony, and in the choices nations make when the guns fall silent. The men who built the camp believed fear would outlast them. They were wrong. What endured instead was evidence and judgment. And in that judgment lies the true meaning of victory. Not the destruction of an enemy, but the refusal to become like him.